YouTube just sent me a notification. Now we're live. So, welcome, lords and ladies of the internet. I'm the King of Candor. This will be the second time we're going live, apparently, today. YouTube's great, so I'm here with my esteemed panel of guests.
Very normal games.
Very normal. We're going to be talking about YouTube just sent me a notification, food in fantasy, and the way that you can use it for your own setting. So, let me know if nobody's coming through correctly on the audio, and otherwise, why don't everybody go around and introduce themselves? First up, Mr. Goat.
I'm Magic Goat. I'm a very normal person and a very normal GM who runs incredibly normal games.
Next, Mr. Pops.
Oh yeah, what's going on, fellas? I go by many names. Folks on Cord know me as Pops. I help out basically managing the server. I not too much experience as far as the fantasy stuff goes. I'm more here to learn things. So I might not do a lot of talking, but I'm happy to be here.
Next, we have my friend Starbolt, Mr. Starbolt.
Yes, thank you. As King mentioned, I'm one of his friends. I do play some tabletop. I've recently started some cooking more stuff, but I'm very interested to see how the inaccuracies of cooking in fantasy, or at least food in fantasy, I should say, and how it can be implemented in an interesting way in fantasy settings.
Got the chat now working. That was on me. Sorry about that. You guys are now on screen. So, yes. Welcome, James. Thank you for the hello. And trying to think, should you have a fourth faction of island natives of kobolds who just worship dragons and really want to be left alone? So, to answer James' question, he's going to become a first-time game master soon. James has played in a couple games with me and with Go and a couple of the other people on our server. He's a great guy, by the way. The server is linked in the description if you guys would like to come join. He has been talking about his game design ideas lately and how he wants to have an island. He's got several factions that he's been working on, and this is the fourth one that he's come up with. The first one are a group of pirates who work for the evil guy who are trying to just take over the area and cause chaos. One of them is a nobleman who's trying to set up a mining operation here. And this is the fourth faction James is working on, and he says it's a group of natives who worship a dragon and want to be left alone. I think that is a great faction idea, James. I think that something important when designing factions in fantasy is you need to see how the factions not just interact with the players, but how they interact with each other. Interfaction play is very important, because without it, you get this kind of weird situation where the factions feel stale because nobody's actually doing anything, which you don't want to have. And that can be easily avoided by making sure that the factions, when they interact with each other, do so in a logical way. Because without it...
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully that can help. Now,
A little logic really fleshes things out.
Yeah. Now, on to the subject of today's video. We're going to be talking about food in fantasy. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I feel like this is a very underlooked at topic when it comes to fantasy. People really like their designing their worlds, they design cool cultures, and I see weapons and armor and all that craziness designed, but nobody talks about food, and food is arguably more important than anything else that you can design. Because what your food is available changes the way people will interact. For example, one of the reasons that the Chinese and Japanese were able to have these huge long sieges is because their nations have rice, and rice keeps very well. So because rice keeps so much better than a lot of other stable grains, it really overpunches its weight in terms of how it is for preservation, which allows these long-term sieges. Now, something like grain takes a lot of effort and a lot of labor to take care of. So because grain is so much harder to harvest and take care of, it tends to lead to a lot more machinery and tools being developed. That's why you see all the water mills and the capturing of different gears here in the West. And then you have something like the Native Americans.
Well, we also...
Go ahead.
I was gonna say we probably also have to take into account like the environment, like certain crops have a certain season. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, that's the next thing. You know, after you look at what crops are available, the environment they're available in is important too. And some food is just so much better than other food in terms of caloric power. Often you see these, like I mentioned, wheat. So you would assume that everybody was eating bread back in the day, when they really weren't. Barley was the thing that a lot of European poor people were eating, because barley is like a more potent version of wheat, and it's way grosser, but it's able to be grown better. Now, potatoes are one of the things that really bothers me. Potatoes are like a superfood. You can almost only eat potatoes and survive on them just because of the nutritional value. But the environment you can grow them in is very limited, as Pops was saying. However, societies that do have potatoes really should have big population surpluses. In fact, this is why you see so many cultures throughout the world. When they get potatoes, they completely take over their culture, like the Irish. The potato was only introduced to Ireland like 300 years ago, yet it is so ubiquitous with their culture that they had multiple famines from not having potatoes around. And I think that's a thing that you could really do interesting with your own fantasy. Like, how cool would it be? Oh, YouTube seems to have broken.
I did see the spinning line of death for a little bit. But I am quite intrigued by what you've mentioned so far. Like earlier when you mentioned rice versus other grains, and then mentioning barley and potatoes, it's like that's actually interesting implications in other areas of life. So
I,
now I'm like, okay, hmm. I could see even just taking rice versus other grains. There's one area where it could affect a fantasy setting. Interesting.
I'd also say, I mean, the availability of food that is universally or available year round can also affect the way that a society develops. You know what I mean? Like if there's no
Ooh.
for let's say somebody to plant and harvest and wait out a season and save food, it will affect the way that they develop over time.
Exactly.
That is true. That is interesting.
And
Yeah, I
also,
mean,
go ahead.
yeah, I'm just going to wrap it up that little point by just saying, yeah, food is like ingrained in like everything that has to do with the development of a local culture, you know?
Yeah, and something else that you have to consider, not just help the goat has taken me hostage and forcing me to watch. Well, good, you should watch. Something else that with along the development of food, not just specifically foods, but spices is something else you should consider. How cool is it that we have all these things available? Think about oregano. Oregano is very like valuable as a resource, even though it's kind of like ubiquitous these days to the point where kids pretend it's marijuana and try to smoke it, which is funny. And whenever you're designing your own settings, you should try to figure out food that makes sense and would help with the cultures there. If you have a tropical environment, obviously having different fruits is going to be important, but consider bananas aren't native to North America. So if you have a culture that's supposed to be like an Aztec society and there's bananas everywhere, people are going to wonder, well, why are there bananas here? This is also a situation where you don't have to create brand new foods. You can create new mixtures of food from just figuring out how a society would interact. One of the most horrible things ever is almost all the Swedish cooking, but the Swedes pretty much invented dessert pizza by putting sliced and fried bananas on their pizza. That's
Is it?
horrible, but dessert pizza came from there, which is an interesting connection.
Dessert pizza is pretty good, so I will
Yeah.
accept the origin of bananas on pizza, despite how horrible that is.
Well, they also put like fish head on there, so I don't.
That is a crime against humanity, right there.
Nordic cooking is not something you want to put on your work.
Environment, the weather, what's seasonally available, it will affect what they can eat. Like, I think it's like become a meme that people in Iceland, right? They eat like the rotting shark. Like, what's that shark? basket. I don't know.
Now, I know you mentioned we don't necessarily have to come up with our own foods. You don't have to make up a fantasy food. That being said, James brought up a really interesting question earlier. How valuable would dragon meat be?
For dragon meat, that's a good question. I think it depends on what are dragons essentially like. Because if you say that dragons are lizards and then you're going to base it on there, lizard meat is really gross. There's a reason we don't cook and eat, like alligator, except for the tail. It's very difficult to get through. And I can imagine dragon would be even worse than gator. However,
Yeah, especially infused with an element.
yeah. However, if it's a magical property thing where eating the flesh of a fire dragon will give you fire resistance, then you better believe the reverse would happen. People would find ways to make this gross food taste good. You know that people would be figuring that out.
Well,
But
I
don't
think
also forget, like, food being kind of gross, especially for other cultures, is kind of part of the charm. Like, there's always, like, durian food. People like to bring that up because it smells bad, right? But
It tastes good when cooked, apparently.
Exactly. So there's just a lot of really interesting ways that you can have food that maybe isn't necessarily super like appetizing to most people, but it still adds like a very interesting bit of flavor to like a zone or area that your players visit or just a part of the world.
Yes.
I wanted to say real quick because I know a little bit about kind of the mythical. I'm glad you brought up the magical properties potentially about, let's say, dragon meat, because I know I read a book when I was a little kid about just the history of dragons in different cultures, Europe, China, everything. And I believe the different parts of the dragon can grant you like different abilities if you eat them. Like, for example, I think that if you eat the tongue, you learn how to speak any language. Like, that sort of thing is fascinating, and that's a good thing, I think, to try and implement.
Oh,
So if a
certainly.
dragon bit their own, if a dragon bit their own tongue, would they be able to converse with whoever they wanted?
Did they swallow it?
Let's say yes.
Then yeah. That assumes that dragons already can't speak any language in your setting. In a lot of myths, they can. They speak in tongues, which basically means they speak through all languages. And that's the myth that's the myth that Pop was referring to. And I think that, like he said, that's a fantastic idea. What if eating dragon wings and you have to fry them up and put them in a lot of butter and oil? What if that makes it so you have not flight per se, but you can like glide a little bit, just a very little bit? That would be interesting. I could see somebody, and I'm pretty sure if we looked hard enough, we could find it. Entire systems around cooking. There's entire animes around cooking the monsters. So why can't you do that?
I could imagine probably different kinds of dragons would be harder to obtain than others. Like,
Oh yeah.
Like for example, red dragons, they're always out causing trouble, and they don't like working with others. So I'd imagine if you want to go take down a red dragon, they're tough, but get a group together, you could probably take one out. Blue dragons, they're all in the desert, so that's hard enough. Their tactics suck, and if you're finding one, you're probably going to find more because they're all in the desert. There's going to be more than one, so that'd be interesting.
I agree. And also something else to consider with that, as Kisume should hear, if tongues from dragons give you all languages, does that mean that dragon tongue is the inspiration for all languages? If that's something that you have in your setting where dragon tongue lets you speak languages, naturally you develop more world building out of that simply from looking at it and saying, well, yeah, that would logically follow. And I think that that's one of the other really cool things about designing food in your fantasy setting is by working on what the foods are and where they're located, you get some really interesting world building done kind of automatically for you. You can't have a fantasy Italy serving spaghetti because if you wanted to just make Italy, they need to get the tomatoes from Central South America. The tomatoes from the Americas, which they didn't even eat until like the late early 1800s because they were convinced tomatoes were poisonous. So you didn't have that. Then you have to get the noodles from China, which are brought over by Marco Polo, we believe. And then you can have spaghetti. That's the most common Italian dish ever, and it's like 200 years old tops, which is absolutely nuts. Culinary arts and the evolution of food is an incredibly modern thing. That's why whenever you look back at some of these old cooking recipes, they're so much more basic. It's not because people back then didn't have creativity, they just didn't have the foods that we have these days. Never mind all the cool food that they hunted to death.
I mean, we still see cultural impact of, accessibility to food today. I'm not sure if this is a big thing throughout Europe, but I have heard, and I've been to Spain, France, and other things my dad has told me. He's been to a bunch of countries. Like, for example, I think how you go to a restaurant and they give you some bread and like it comes with butter. I believe in some European countries they just don't give you butter. So like there's different things that still affect us even to this day in the real world.
Oh, that's another. Jacob brings up a fantastic point that I was going to talk about later. Europe started wars over spices. One of my favorite stories is the Dutch sent guys around the world, and like there's 1,000 of them, 800 of them died, and they came back with like 2 weeks worth of nutmeg, and it was considered a resounding success.
Well, that's one thing. I thought of it before, and I just it went out of my head for a little bit. You know how basically it became a meme that like the British conquered the world for spices? It's basically a form of currency at that point. Super valuable.
Oh yeah, and on top of the fact, like nations, the Europeans had to develop technology to get around the Ottomans to be able to get these spices. Imagine if nations were able to trade freely. The Ottomans weren't this monolithic middleman between everybody. If they could just trade equally, you know how much power nations that grew spices would have? This would be an unparalleled luxury good. You could have just a handful of islands that basically have the spice wizards in control of everything. And these guys would run the show over there. Good luck trying to take over the islands that they run, because they have all the spices with economic power, and now they got wizards protecting them. I think that would be huh?
Yeah.
And
I love the idea of spice wizards.
Right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, you just brought up a great idea, the idea that some food literally grants magic powers.
Oh yeah.
Here's an interesting bit. How would Spice Wars and spices in general relate to prestidigitation? Because I believe you can flavor things with prestidigitation.
Yes, you can.
Well,
but here's the fine line, though, is that if you're going to have it be so valuable because it, is a form of currency or grants power, you have to pay attention to like maybe making it harder to access just in general, because otherwise the world wouldn't make sense.
Or you could just write your world in a way that has that. One of the best D&D settings is Eberron, and they basically went, okay, magic is everywhere, now what happens? And they got trains, and they got basically cowboys, and they got hobbits riding dinosaurs. It's awesome, the Eberron setting. Because they just said, what if magic was cranked up to where it should be? And Goat, you're about to say something?
Well, I was just going to say earlier that if you wanted to keep something like prestidigitation in a world where spice is so valuable, maybe prestidigitation just can't copy the flavor. But as you said, Eberron is a great example of a world where they just took everything to its logical extreme, If you can make a bear trap that heals you and it costs a wizard like 1,000 gold to do so, of course every single hospital in the world is just going to be bear traps.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And then
go ahead.
I want to finish this prestidigitation thing. I think the prestidigitation kind of falls into the same category to me mentally as people who want to play druids that transform into monsters and people who want to summon things. I, as a game master, do not let people summon anything or turn into anything if they have no way of knowing what it is. Same thing with prestidigitation. If you've never tasted nutmeg, how do you know how to make something taste like nutmeg?
Oh, absolutely.
That simple fix right there really makes it, because now spices can be ubiquitous and transported. I don't have to have wizards all day taking dabs of nutmeg just to learn how to enchant my soup. I could just go buy a little bit of nutmeg and have that. It's way cheaper to have, nutmeg here and cumin here and some vanilla extract here than going out and paying for a professional spicy wizard who just flavors my stuff for me.
I do like the idea, though, of like using different elements to try and approximate maybe the same taste or maybe the same effects of something that you might not have access to, but instead you say, well, let me mix food A plus food B, and that'll give me the same abilities as some other thing. It takes more effort, but obviously you got to do what you got to do.
Oh yeah, and then there's also some interesting stuff. I never see people have coffee in their fantasy settings. And if it is, they always think of it as like it's weird that coffee's here. Coffee's been around for hundreds of years. It was just this like gross black sludge back in the day before they really figured out how to percolate it right, but there's no reason that you can't have coffee in your setting. So use modern stuff too. In fact, I'm going to give a little inside baseball here. In my own setting of Enos, soda exists. Because all soda requires is a lot of different roots that have been boiled out, and you add carbon to a water to make it carbonated. They figured out carbonation on accident in the 1759, I believe it was. I looked this up the other day. So now you've got all these people in the 1700s who figured out how to make soda while they were smelting iron, all the carbon that would rise up, they put a bladder above it to absorb the excess carbon so it would get stuck in the water. So now they have, carbonated water. They had that in the 1700s, and they discovered it on pure accident. You have a setting here where people can just create fire very easily and burn stuff. I can imagine entire places just burning logs just to create carbonated water just to put in their soda. What an interesting and awesome idea.
What do people typically have? Is it tea instead of coffee, or...
They just don't have morning drinks in a lot of their settings, which I find fascinating. Like, I see tea, I see water, I see beer. I don't even see vodka in a lot of fantasy settings, which, again, blows my mind. Like, wine is also in a lot of places. All the awesome foods that we have in modern day, all these especially alcohols, just make a fantasy analog for them. I want my margarita.
Sorry, man. There's a few different ways to make vodka, right? Like, there's Russian potato vodka, right?
Yep. Vodka usually requires a potato as a base, but again, a lot of these people just have potatoes everywhere. This is actually something that, if I want to nitpick for a second, Tolkien failed at in Lord of the Rings. This is one of the few true errors in the Lord of the Rings. Remember, the Lord of the Rings is supposed to be a mythical prehistory for England. If that's the case, Sam cannot grow potatoes. He just can't. He can't love potatoes because there's no way that existed. They're interesting. Go ahead.
From South America, right?
Yes, they're from the Andes Mountains. And I think it's really funny that if you consider that it really boils down to, Tolkien was awesome at linguistics, but this is a thing that he didn't do. You now, person listening to this podcast in 2024, can go out and make your own fantasy world with a little bit of touch of flavor that Tolkien didn't have. My dad is a great chef, and he cooks food all the time for us. I told him, now that he wants to DM, that he really should focus on describing different foods to us. And it's worked out fantastically. It's really cool to see how whenever we go to a tavern, Dad describes a new recipe I've never heard of before, or that he cooked me once years ago. And it's just kind of cool because of that, my own setting, we've added some iconic things to it. The Kobold video, which is coming out either tomorrow or a week from tomorrow, I go into talking about how kobolds in my settings absolutely love meat. Now, the fact that they love meat, Dad looked at that and said, well, why don't they cook scrapple? I'm like, what the heck is scrapple? And it's like this thing that the Northeast cooks a lot, where it's a briquette of leftover meats. You put them together, you sometimes put a little like bread in between them to help them bind, or sometimes some oil or some grits or something, and you basically bake a hot dog as a brick. And that sounded awesome, like all this different meat mixed together. That's pretty cool. So now the kobolds who love meat totally would have that. And now you have competing kobold chefs for who makes the best scrapple. James says, Middle Earth to me had never been an English thing, but I didn't know he's basing this off this weird origin story for England. Yeah, the Lord of the Rings is really interesting. So the way that Lord of the Rings works is, allegedly, Frodo and Bilbo wrote, and Sam a little bit, wrote the Lord of the Rings books we see. Then Pippin took them, finished them, and took them to Gondor. I believe it was Pippin. Or maybe Merry or Pippin. I mixed them up a lot. One of them took it to Gondor, and it became the Red Book of the West Marches. While he served in Gondor, he kept it with him, and then when he died, it was buried with him. Then, either a Viking named Hjörkrir or Tolkien himself discovered this book and kept it. Then Hjörkrir died and Tolkien excavated his tomb, or Tolkien himself has it, and in there he found a Viking translation of the book. So Tolkien could speak, ancient Norse, he could speak Nordic, so he read it in Nordic, then he read the Hobbit version, which was translated over. And that's how the Lord of the Rings comes to us. Just a fun little the meta narrative of how the Lord of the Rings was invented. And he also wrote
a hilariously fantastic, convoluted way to do things.
Isn't it? That's one thing I love about Tolkien. He, a lot of his stuff, he never did it just willy-nilly. It's just so much fun that... Because that's a fun thing, It's fun to think that. Yep. Snowcrow knows. Scrapple is fantastic.
I'll have to try out Scrapple sometime. I'm quite interested in whatever this mystery food is.
Oh, yeah. It's quite fun.
It's a mix of different meats?
Yep.
So sausage or Spam?
Kinda. You can mix it with sausage, but it's not like, sausage itself is in a tube, in a casing. This is just like fried together.
But again, that's another great way to incorporate it into your world building. Like, why do you think a culture might need to different meats?
Yeah. And also, imagine the way society can function if you have all this meats. You know how hard it is to have
that's
all
how
this
they eat the dragon meat. They convert it into Scrapple.
Oh, there you go. But imagine for a second if you're... Hang on 1 second, guys. I'm having an issue with the Wi-Fi. It just popped up. You all can keep talking. I'll be right back.
Okay, guys, we got to keep this stream entertaining and informative. So let's see. What are some other fantasy
start
food topics?
Screaming.
No. Okay, you only scream. Somebody brings over ice cream in a fantasy setting, and I imagine that would be super rare in most situations, because most of the time fantasy is kind of medieval, and you don't have a way to keep it cold.
Well, you could always have it be like a cold region thing, like some sort of local delicacy.
So maybe there's a bit of tourism in the cold area because of this really delicious dessert they have.
Well, that's
totally do that.
If you're going to have it be in a bit of, I don't want to say primitive, but medieval is a good way to put it. Is dessert going to become such a wide cultural thing? Because if you're mixing that are scraps basically and leftovers to make into a hot dog brick, like the king was saying, who's to say that you logically would have something that's regarded as a treat that's widely available?
Well, it could be a rich person thing.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it sounds like it depends on what kind of setting do you want, and if you are going to have it, what's the logical explanation behind it? Because as soon as we can explain it logically, in accordance to the rules of the universe you're working with, then things start to fall together and become interesting.
The king, yeah.
Speaking of interesting things, welcome back. Speaking of interesting things, I was going to say, another thing you can do with food is you could give it a little bit more mechanical value. If, for example, you wanted to set a game where getting food is maybe important for either your characters' communities or the plot or for something, you could totally do things like, say, instead of having magic potions, you have magic teas, and they could work the exact same way, or you could tweak them a little bit. Maybe they last for an entire day, or maybe it's more like it lasts until you get cold.
Until you get cold. That
Until you
I'm
cool down. While the tea keeps you warm, you physically get empowered by magic.
I like the idea of whatever the source of it is, whether it's food or something else, of keeping some kind of beneficial or detrimental effect until you enter some kind of environmental change.
Yeah, you could have all sorts of cool things going on with that. All sorts of very interesting incentive for players on how they act or perform. Or, maybe we brought up Spice Wizards earlier. Maybe there's a magic tea in the desert that only gives you power while you're really hot. So if you ever leave the desert, or during the nighttime when the desert's cold, you lose power. Maybe you even have to keep yourself dangerously heated. And so while you're using this item, you're putting your life in active danger. A lot of
Get
cool
levels
ideas.
of exhaustion if you're playing 5th edition, for example.
There you go. That's a great example. Or you take, I don't know, do they have non-lethal in 5th edition still?
I don't know, but I know they have it in 3rd edition. So if you're playing 3rd edition or Pathfinder, you can take non-lethal.
There we go.
I think it's a thing in the rules. I do know in practicality it is. Technically, I don't know.
So I want to talk to Jacobs here in the chat for a second. He's got a lot of great posts here. Because Kasumi also brings its ice boxes a few minutes ago, and then they elaborate on that. Yeah, ice boxes and keeping things cold is super important back in the day. In fact, one of the claims that the Persian kings had to the fact that they should be in charge of all the Middle East was the fact that they had ice cream, which is really funny to talk about now, but that was one of the things that Alexander the Great had to contend with, that the Greeks didn't have ice cream, so he had to figure out how to get ice cream to prove his legitimacy. In fact, one of the tales of Alexander says he had a lot of debts to pay, and his debts were so high that he couldn't afford them. However, a local merchant had a mint plant, and Alexander seized it, and with 3 leaves, he was able to pay his army's wages for 3 months. 3 mint leaves. That's how valuable the mint plant was. So when you have stuff like that,
mint chocolate chip ice cream.
Oh yeah. So when you have ice cream and mint, as key cornerstones of real world history, you totally can have it do some cool stuff. I think it's I think it's highly underrated, the whole way that food interacts. And like Jacob said, this is why you have undergrounds. Cellars exist because it's cooler under there. It's basically free cooling. So you put your meats, you put your sausages, and all your other, spoilables underground.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point too. And I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but it is relevant to bring up underground because I mean, there's an entirely different environment under there. Like, for example, I work with animals. For anyone who doesn't know in the chat, I'm the animal guy, but it's an entire environment. Let's say if you see a possum or a raccoon or whatever go in towards a sewer, even stray cats or feral cats, I mean, they use those areas as highways, and they like them, and some animals will nest down there because it's cool in the summer, it's warm in the winter, it's like a constant environment, and it's a naturally made. Well, not sewers themselves, but the underground in general.
Yeah.
An interesting thing with underground and food and things of that nature is that in a lot of fantasy settings, they'll have that, Warhammer is a great example. They're the under roads that things like dwarves and skavens use. And when you think about it, food keeps better there, but it's also probably harder to get in large enough quantities to, feed a family. And I don't remember, I haven't read up on the Underdark in a while. I know they have a lot of mushrooms and things down there. But foods from the surface to the underground and vice versa, or using foods as a means of trade, could be a very interesting plot hook for a lot of games as well, or for a lot of stories.
I agree. In fact,
Hold on, you got some oranges? Hold on, maybe we can talk. You got access to oranges? Let's make a deal.
Oh, yeah. This is something Tolkien even recognized. If you look at some of the writings that he has, the reason Lake Town exists where it does in The Hobbit is because they fish and they farm, and they can trade their food to the dwarves underground for all the dwarven minerals and weapons and armor. That's already a core part of fantasy. So you're not even worrying about treading new grounds that nobody's touched before. It's pretty awesome that you could use that and it's already there. I think anyway. It's just me.
Tolkien did it, therefore you got kudos.
Yeah, you got permission.
You got permission. There we go.
Well, you'll be shocked. One of the most common things that I see online that a lot of people have, in my opinion, issues with is asking for permission. You shouldn't go get permission to do stuff. You should be confident in your own self to say, if as long as you put in the effort, I can do something like this. Players, yeah, you got to go ask permission because you're not designing your games. You're at the whim of your dungeon master. But dungeon masters, if you want to do something kind of weird, as long as it's not like something that'll trigger people like sexual or extremely violent. If you got a quirky fantasy idea, like maybe all the kobolds in your settings have laser eyes, okay, work with it, figure it out, give it the time it needs, and see if it works. Don't be afraid to just do stuff that's kind of weird. And I think that going back to chat for a sec, Mr. Jacob says that he has homebrewed a lot of magic foods in his games, and I think that it's a great way to do that. If you don't have a cooking skill in your game already, like a crafting thing, just use survival is a pretty easy catch-all, and I think that really allows players to have a more interesting take on the world. It's cool whenever you can kill a monster and get some benefit from cooking. In fact, in one of my home games, my players killed a Hydra, and they cooked the heart together, and they screwed it up, so nobody got any benefits from it. And it was a really impactful moment where, crap, we should have put more points into our cooking skills. Which is, I think, more interesting than them succeeding and getting +1 hit point.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Trying to use those skills that tend to go underutilized. I like that.
Jacob's just got lighting up chat. For those of you who are just watching, he's got a whole bunch of fun facts about the way the underground works and how heating works, and it's awesome. And Kasume brings up a blurb about Underdark food. I actually hate the Underdark in D&D. It's both really cool and then incredibly stupid at the same time. Every really cool thing that happens in the Underdark, as you start reading more about it, they then have some stupid blurb. Like you said, the food thing, there's this really cool food source down here, spider silk. We can eat it like spaghetti. Oh, that's cool, but the minute it gets to the surface, it disappears, and everybody thinks you're crazy. Why would you do that? That's dumb. Let it be more fun. Let me have a spider silk farm. I want spider spaghetti, dang it.
Let me farm my spider silk.
Exactly.
On one hand, if you have things like spider silk that's super nutritious, you run into players who just are like, oh, let's pause the main campaign to kidnap a bunch of these animals and then raise them on a monster farm. On the other hand, who doesn't want to run a monster farm? That sounds pretty cool to me.
I remember running an adventure recently that I was originally planning this to be like a sneaking session through an abyssal jungle. So you're trying not to make noise, you're trying not to make lights. You got to find your way through this jungle without causing attention, because if you cause attention, a horde of demons is just going to come at you. And the moment they get there, they completely forget about all that advice, and they're just immediately bombarding a bunch of demons. And then I thought, you know what? I feel I can adapt this to let's say instead of this being a sneaky thing, which let's be honest, those characters weren't designed to be sneaky. Let's just make this you're fighting through hordes. And the moment they get there, they completely seal yourself off so the horde doesn't chase you. That was kind of fun. I think sometimes it's worth considering, hey, what if I just switched main objective of the campaign or the little mission that we're doing? What if I just switch things up?
I agree. Also, Jacob, I understand what you're saying. I still hate it. I don't care if there's an excuse that, you go into a different dimension. That's really goofy and dumb. And that's one of my biggest problems with D&D. All the coolest parts about D&D are on another plane of existence. That's coward talk. Have an entire section of your planet where there's just an island that has no gravity. Be a man. I hate that stuff so much. Like, have cool, weird stuff. Dude, Canada, all right, go look at the Canadian plate. There's an entire scientific field that we think magnets might not even exist because there's a part of Canada that has 10% less gravity than the rest of the world, and we have no idea why. Like, there's some wacky stuff on this planet. Oh, yeah. There's some absolutely nutty things that are happening on our planet, and there's no reason that you have to restrict all the cool stuff to this weird, totally not another planet type thing that D&D has.
That being said, if you want to include like player food coming into your setting, that could also be a lot of fun. Planescape is one of my favorite settings. I don't remember reading much about food, but now thinking about it, think about how interesting would it be for a place where different, not just like, the like elemental and magic planes, but just the regular planes intersect with each other and how much that would change culture and food. That's pretty much what happened in the real world. If you go on YouTube, you're basically going into another plane of existence and looking at all the different cooking people do.
Oh, yeah. Imagine. It's funny. Those of you who've played my first campaigns, there's a couple of you guys watching my players, you were probably right now thinking of the divine spaghetti that Saint Evan has. And so, yes, that is a food made. It's a food made from basically his hair because he's a saint of spaghetti. He was a player character, if you couldn't tell. He's not only a saint of spaghetti. He did other things, but he liked spaghetti.
Yeah, that's great. That's like the Italian Samson.
Pretty much.
Italian Samson.
Yeah, he's like, if you cut the spaghetti off my head, I'd lose all my...
Something I do wonder about is food and fantasy has become slightly more popular recently. At least because in places like Japan, they care a lot more about cooking and cuisine and stuff like that. So I wonder if that's going to be a trend we actually see, is more and more cooking and fantasy, or at least more interesting.
Are you saying more Japanese people are playing tabletop?
Oh, yes.
Yes, there are a lot of interesting Japanese tabletops as well.
Yeah, what I like about it is that you are integrating pretty much... I know it's a separate setting in a different world, but everything is still trying to become more and more realistic,
Yeah, and it's not just realism in the sense that it needs to be purely logic-based and follow through with, the way the world works. It's fleshing things out in a way that just makes it so much more fun. I'm going to tell you guys right now, one of the things that really, I think, stands out when you go back and play something like the Morrowind game from 2001, you have to dig underground to get eggs. That's so weird. Like, egg farmers just dig in the dirt to get eggs from these, like, weird monsters, and they're completely normal there. And they crack them and cook them just like chicken eggs. You mine for eggs.
What kind of eggs?
Kwama? It's a fictional species.
Delicious kwama eggs.
There's absolutely animals in real life that bury their eggs. For example, Canadian geese actually will bury their eggs, and they'll lay them one at a time, but then they'll bury them, go back, unbury the nest, lay another one, and then they'll all hatch at the same time. So, I mean, it still has a basis in reality as far as, like, wildlife behavior goes.
Oh, yeah. I think that's really cool.
I wouldn't depend on that as like an entire farming system, unless you got the monsters contained.
Well, that's the thing. They lock these kwamas in these cells, and then they let them go underground to lay their eggs, and they feed them so much that they just keep laying eggs, which pushes them underground for the miners to mine out. It's so weird in Morrowind. But, like, that's a good thing. You want to have weird stuff. That's hyper impactful. And I think Jacob brings up another point here again, that the reason it's becoming popular is because cooking has been tied to buffs in a lot of Japanese RPGs lately, so they've thought about cooking more. And because more people are thinking about cooking, they're starting to think about fantasy cooking. Gators, crocs, and turtle, yeah, they all bury their eggs too. I think dragons should bury their eggs as well, personally.
I think you can base it off the dragon species if you want to make it interesting. That being said, talking about Kwama eggs and not basing your, food production on it, that is a thing in game and a thing in fantasy settings. If you go and kill the Kwama queen, there's a famine in Morrowind. You can create a famine. And having like fantasy ecology, especially with food, can lead to some really interesting storytelling moments.
Again,
Absolutely.
and I want to again talk to chat for a sec. It's hard to implement cooking and food techniques in a tabletop game since that's yet another thing a DM has to learn. I both agree and disagree. If you don't want to focus on it, don't focus on it. Or go pick up a book or tell your players, okay, if you want that, you do it. It's very easy. And if you have a player who's on fire, like my dad, for example, he totally would sit there and tell me the exact stats that every recipe has and what they should do. As long as I give him parameters. He just loves cooking and he understands it so well. I have other players who microwave TV dinners is already too much cooking for them. They don't want to deal with that. So, as long as mommy brings in their chicken nuggets, they're happy. Now,
something that I've
I'm sorry.
Something that I've noticed in this conversation so far is that even if you don't necessarily want to go full on cooking with your setting, because it is another thing to add, it does seem to be a useful way of generating cool ideas. Like, I never would have thought about dragon meat giving these new magical properties if we weren't talking about food and fantasy. Well, so even though I don't necessarily plan to, even if I don't necessarily plan to make food a big deal, generates an idea.
Yeah, and I know I'm bringing up something that was probably from like 20 minutes ago, but you did say, I forget who it was exactly, but you said, the way that food affects, or not the food, like environment, like the desert would affect you and your own stats. I would say it's more about how the environment would affect the food, which at the same time would mean you need to have, items, tools, and everything that can preserve the food. And like, I feel like that would be something that it should be incorporated realistically if you want to have food be this important. That like, let's say you got to have a mobile. I don't want to say icebox because obviously carrying a whole chest freezer with you is ridiculous.
So
but at the same time,
but I will tell you right now, Pops, there's this thing in D&D called a bag of holding, where it's basically like a knapsack that you could put like 50 tons worth of stuff in it. It doesn't weigh anything. Logically speaking, if you would put a freezer in there, it would become, as I call, a bag of colding. So now it's basically a mobile freezer.
Jacob, I don't know if you mean that in jest or not, but
I'm serious. It's in the setting.
In kids' game, I have a ice bag of holding.
Yeah, it's a bag of colding. It's great.
Yeah, I have a bag of holding specifically so that I could capture put monster meat in it.
I didn't give it a name, but I've used bags of colding in certain missions that I ran. It's like, you're supposed to get this, use this to keep it cold and preserve it.
So there you go, Pops. We totally can do
it. What's the maintenance?
Another thing, if you don't have,
there is no maintenance on it. You just have to clean it every once in a while so don't get moldy.
Okay, here's a maintenance. Don't put it in another hole.
Yeah.
Don't put it in an extra dimensional hole. You do that, you are going to regret having it.
That'll rip a hole in
the
reality.
Maintenance. Yeah, don't put it in another reality hole.
That's the advice my dad gave me when I told him I was thinking about getting married. He goes, don't put it in another hole.
Could you make that cast iron bag of holding in the plane of fire and just throw things in and hold them out cooked? Can you make a bag of slow cooking?
I don't see why you couldn't make a bag of like crock pot cooking or something, a crock pot of holding. Maybe that's something we need to talk about this offline. We can't give chat all of our ideas.
Put an old goblin in there, and you can make a crock pot of holding.
Crockpots are a great invention.
They really are. Oh my gosh.
True.
All right, that's another thing. Spinning off the food for just 2 seconds. When you're talking about fantasy, people really need to get better, especially if you're wanting to be a designer. if you're just a casual person who just wants to hang out and just play their games normally, this section isn't for you. But if you want to be like Mr. 10th level game designer and I've designed 100 worlds, stop designing your worlds. They all suck. Get better technological designs. It really bugs me that rubber doesn't exist in fantasy settings. The only reason that we don't have rubber bands until like really late in our society is because rubber was nowhere near the rest of the world. Even with the limited rubber designs that they had, the Mesoamericans made balls, they made rubber bands a little bit, they made a lot of rubber technology. Just, it bothers the heck out of me that whenever I see people like, oh, you can't have rubber in your setting because wasn't a historical invention. No, it was. They just didn't know where rubber was. Go look at the societies who had access to this thing and see all the awesome, cool stuff that they did do with it. I don't want to throw shade, but the Mesoamericans were very technologically behind compared to the rest of the world with metallurgy and with a lot of, they didn't even invent the wheel. And these guys could figure out rubber balls. I'm sorry, but a society that has ironworking and smithing that can make just guns totally could invent it. Another side note. I want to talk about the lemon real quick. This is going to blow your mind. Guns and gunpowder were invented before lemons were invented. Just think about that to blow your mind with history.
Well, that's another
lemons
thing
were invented?
They
Yes.
were accidentally invented, right? It was like Chinese fireworks, and they found out, oh, this thing is explosive, and then I know I'm not exactly sure what it is, but my understanding is always like Europeans discovered it. They were like, oh, we can use this to make a weapon out of it, basically.
So what happened is really cool. You're very close, Pops. They wanted to find the way to have immortality for gunpowder. So they accidentally invented gunpowder. It turns out that smoking gunpowder does not give you infinite life. It does the opposite. Then they realized, hey, you can make cool things with this. So then they made, fireworks. Then they made fire arrows, where it was arrows that exploded after they were shot. Then they realized, hey, we could stuff things into a barrel and shoot it out. That's basically where Chinese technology ended. Because their walls were so much worse, they never needed to blow holes in them. They started fighting the Arabs. The Arabs realized, oh, this is really cool. Let's use this to go kill those Christians. So they took it and they started attacking Christians with them. And they kept building bigger and better cannons. The Ottomans were awesome at this. They built cannons that were like, they could shoot bullets the size of your car at the walls of Constantinople. Just crazy stuff. Then the Europeans said, that's really cool, but we need to get these cannons on top of mountains to shoot at some of these castles. Can we make them smaller? And then can we make them small enough that I can hold one in my hand? And then what if I don't have to hold it in my hand? What if I could rest it in my hand? And maybe I can make a cannon small enough to shoot one guy instead of a group of guys. And that's how guns got invented. But yeah, that's all happened hundreds of years. You could reasonably track the first gun to at least 850. 100% guns existed in 850. They were crude and they were very poorly designed, but you could definitely do that. I've seen people push it further to like 900, but for me it's 850. There's a specific gun I'm thinking of. I don't know the name of it right now. I could pull it up if people want me to later. Lemons were not invented until 925 in Damascus when they accidentally mixed an orange and a citron fruit in the garden of the sheik there. So guns were around and they were killing people with them, and then they invented lemons.
Yeah, that's so funny to me, man.
They invented some, like, just a new fruit? They just invented a new fruit?
Yeah, and limes were invented afterwards.
What the heck?
Lemons and limes are not naturally occurring.
Weird.
That's man-made.
Yeah, it's great. This goes back to what I was saying about food. That's what they did when all they had to do was put like two plants next to each other, and they got some crazy new plant out of it. Imagine if you could like actually have weirdo hybrid fruit with magic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, the Chinese fire
Or
tube.
with polymorph.
Yep, consume. They're called
we're
Chinese
not- we're
fire
not-
lances.
Good news, we discovered a new fruit. Bad news, it's alive and carnivorous.
Exactly.
Well, I guess you could do that, yeah.
Why not? If you put magic into it.
Oh my god, it's so good. We need to hire more adventurers to go out and murder these delicious plants.
Well, that's funny you mentioned that. There's a race that I have that's not going to be in the core book for my setting. I something I wanted to do with my setting, and it just bothers me about D&D. They have too many races in their setting that are all in the Forgotten Realms and kind of make the map really weird. There's like all these different people who have like just show up random, like, oh, we also found this island that like 28 hippo people live on, and now they're a player race. To me, that's really lame. I understand wanting to create more races, though, because game masters and players like the options. So for my game, I have my setting, and it's set in stone. There's no more races that are going to be added to it. However, I'm adding a race book afterwards. Because they don't have to exist normally, these races are going to be some wacky, some wild, some interesting things. The reason I bring it up is one of the races I have is a race of fruit people. And these fruit people, yeah, they can regrow their bodies, but they're really delicious. So people just come up and cut their arms off and chew on them.
Oh my goodness.
Delicious.
That'd be funny, yeah, if you would just, instead of like an organ donor, you're just like, yeah, just take my arm. I'll feed the population. It'll grow back.
And like that's such a weird thing. And like it doesn't fit with the world of Enos that I designed, but I could totally see some game master saying, "This is so cool. I need these fruit people in my setting." And I want them to be able to have the really interesting. Well, I know, I guarantee Goat would put them in his games, but like I want people to have these as options because it's really cool and they're mechanically difficult to design. This is not something that I'd expect an average game master to be able to whip up. I'm pretty sure that I don't need 10 different types of elves. I think an average game master can make a high elf, an ice elf, a snow elf, a cold elf. I don't know what the difference between all those guys are, but each one has a different Wikipedia entry on the Forgotten Realms for a reason, so I assume they have different powers. But they can design those things. I should be using me as the professional guy to design the really hard to tackle stuff. The stuff that nobody wants to.
You're assuming I don't have cannibal mushroom people in my setting.
Hey, man. Cannibal mushroom people are great.
There you go. Gnomes that make you explode into more gnomes if you eat too many of them? Very fair. Very logical. Very normal.
You make that joke, but something I have as a design choice in my game that I've told James about is Troll's Blood. Trolls in my setting are cool because it's not really one organism. It's kind of like a hive of organisms that all hate you and want to kill you for existing. So because of that, every part of the troll despises you. So if you cut off its arm, it'll still try to strangle you with its arm. The really cool part is, though, if like you cut a troll in half, its organs will come out and try to grab you and pull you in so it can eat you. Because of this, trolls have a lot of regenerative properties as well. Theoretically, you could take a small bit of troll blood and drink it as a potion, like a minor health potion. It's very risky, though, because if you drink too much of that and you get too much troll's blood in you, it reactivates and tries to make a new troll from eating you from the inside out. Because of this, a lot of gangs in the setting will take troll's blood and put it in their potions, like cutting their potency in order to make them stretch a little further. So now you get trolls popping up in a lot of seedy parts of town because they're selling cheap health potions. I think it's a great setting idea.
I agree.
That'd be great, yeah.
Yeah, and I gave that to James because he wanted to have gangs in one of his games. And I told him about it, and he's like, oh, that's really cool.
It's like the fantasy version of like cutting your drugs with fentanyl.
Exactly. Cutting your potions with troll's blood. So, and it all goes back to food, man.
Fun, different ways to use food. That being said, if you don't want to use food in your setting, or you don't want to go too much into it, that doesn't necessarily, detract completely from the setting. But it is a very fun, underused tool.
Yeah. I'm not saying that every game master needs to do this. I don't even think most of them are going to do this. But I think if you're trying to find a spot that you can color yourself, like color into your setting that's unique to you, that's an easy one. That's one that's very underutilized. And it's also, like we've shown tonight, a lot of fun. You can get some really cool, quirky ideas. So, I'm just happy that soda can exist at Enos. That was something I was working on for weeks there, trying to figure out how I could have soda. So now you can have an
You
ice cold Coca-Cola and cerveza.
a cerveza cristal. Here's another one, and this is kind of random, but it's a thought I had, and I was trying to think about how to work it in. The idea of like having, let's say, fruit people or mushroom people that you can chop off their arm and eat it, and it's good for you. What if there's a different demographic that has beliefs about like, oh well, we're not allowed to eat this certain type of food, and so you refuse to eat the fruit people because it's not halal or whatever.
Oh, yeah. I think that would be very interesting to consider. How do you feel about eating sentient people if they want to be eaten?
Mm.
It could also make the area an interesting refuge. Maybe you meet a couple of fruit people that don't want to be eaten that live there. Or maybe the really tasty sentient species, flocks to those areas because it's the safest place they can go.
You just hide here for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I like that idea that Jacob has in chat. The living fruit and vegetable people were created when a druid and a wizard screwed around with the true resurrection spell and mixed it with a channel growth spell, and it went bad. And you're correct about that. That a 200-mile radius is a real big area. People don't seem to understand. You really don't need to map an entire planet. You can really do a lot with having basically the town that you're in and 50 miles around it. That's all you need to run an entire D&D game. I ate the fruit. Yeah, you now have the ability to turn other fruits into fruits. And also, Kasume, I saw the thing about the crossbreeds. I will get into crossbreeding races one day. It is one of the most annoying and confusing parts about D&D's lore. And I think that you'll have to have so many charts and so many different rules to effectively adjudicate it. It's a headache, if you ask me.
Yeah, for sure.
So does anybody have any questions about fruit or any other fantasy, I guess, food items that you want to bring up or ask about?
I'm drawing a blank here.
It's all right. I'm going to go back to something said way earlier in chat then. Okay. The stream just blinked for a second. It startled me. Sorry. So the idea that you have to like develop a different stat for every single type of food, I saw it brought up earlier in chat. I don't think that's really needed. You only should have, to me, the super important meals give stat effects if that's something you want to worry about. Obviously, if you want to have a stat line for what potatoes and carrots do and they multiply and divide off each other, go for it. I'm not going to stop you. But if you're looking for just, hey, I want a practical, gameable thing to put into my setting, then make it so mythical, not just creatures, I should say, but like mythical beings are the ones that have the meals that you can be associated with them. And you don't have to break down their whole body, but just, hey, I want to consume the tongue of a dragon. That will give me tongues. That's all you need to give them. They're not going to kill that many dragons. A dragon's tongue probably can feed one, maybe two people. So now the party has to decide who gets the dragon's tongue. It's just another piece of the reward that they have to divide up amongst themselves. If you kill a Hydra and you want to consume the Hydra's, heart, or a Behir and consume the electric sac that the Behir has to try to gain power from it, that's fine. They're not going to be fighting these things every single day in droves. Now, if they do fight them in droves, then you don't want to worry about the mechanics of them, make them temporary effects. Not every buff needs to be some permanent thing you can do. You also don't need to let the players do it. If you're worried that the players are going to have to keep track of every little detail and all these little things, just tell them they have to take it back to town to an expert who can cook it. They don't get weird and freaked out about you having to take supplies back to a smith to make objects for them. Knowing that, use the same logic for these food items. Just give them some way to preserve them, like I said, the bag of coaling earlier, and it's going to be fine. They'll be able to get everything. How would you cook a dragon's tongue? Carefully. That's the answer.
I'd say if it's relevant to like the overall culture and like, there's a overall kind of understanding among the general population that a certain thing will be this valuable, then yeah, I mean, people are going to know how to cook it, and whatnot.
And if they don't know how to cook it, they'll know how to get somebody who can. Now, to give a serious answer to your question of how do you cook a dragon's tongue, I'm going to assume that you're talking about fire dragons here, because the rest of them you could just cook with fire. But fire dragon's tongue, maybe you have to cook them with freezer burn. You have to get them cold enough. That's another interesting way to have a twist on that thing.
That's why the best cuisine is a ice dragon tongue and a fire dragon tongue. You see, when you tie them together, they both cook each other at just the right temperature.
Exactly. It's perfect all around. It's just
Also,
a fantastic thing. Yes?
It's also a delicious thing. Another thing is if you really want to have like food buffs in your game, like, food grants temporary buffs, you could always rip off things that have already done it. For example, if you want like food to give temporary buffs, it doesn't have to be every single vegetable in the world gives a different buff. You could just group things by food categories and have them provide something similar. If you really want to have every single magical creature give out a magical buff, D&D does a thing where like different body parts can give you different buff. Like it's usually like head slot items that give you, and you can have something similar like all goblinoids / greenish monsters give like this buff if you eat them. You can generalize it a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact.
And again, the goal here is to make your setting more fun for you to develop and work with.
You can think about adding food and spices like this. You're just adding flavor to the world. It doesn't have to be the main course.
Literally this time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you make a certain food, and then if you add a certain spice, it changes the buff.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. You could totally make a whole system around that if you really wanted to. Like where you add, I don't know, maybe there's some type of spice that inverses the buffs, right? You never know. And maybe they get a bunch of poisonous food and they use the inverse buffing spice. It really, you can gamify it as much or as little as you want.
Exactly. Redeeming, not making food mechanical in nature, explain feasts and details. Yeah, that's another thing too. Just don't say, here's a hero's feast, have fun. Describe everything that they get when they go to the Golden Corral buffet. They the cheap $3 steaks that they get to eat as many as they want of. Just having the different cultural foods play an aspect is really important. And again, you can have some really cool world building stuff here. Fun fact, corn is one of the most ubiquitous starches in the world, but it's actually really bad for you because corn is the only starch that I know of that lacks niacin. Now, that's super important for your body. Besides all the other things you usually get enough of it from just eating like bread and such. Some people have a deficiency, but most of the time you're good. Now, because niacin is required, a lot of the early settlers would starve to death, essentially, from eating only corn. And you might ask, well, how did the Native Americans not do this? Because whenever they made corn and tortillas with them, they threw a pinch of ash into there. Ash has got a lot of niacin into it just because it's, it's made from charcoal and the way trees burn. So by them doing that, they essentially made themselves have the nutrients they needed, and the settlers didn't know that. So they saw these natives throwing ash in their food and like, oh, These idiots, why would you throw dirt into your food? We know so much better than that. And they end up starving and dying because of lack of nutrition, which is fascinating that these guys knew to throw ash into your food. I wouldn't even think to do that.
Yeah, that's the funny thing. Like the human body, obviously, if you're going to use different races, maybe have some race that can actually process corn and turn it into a different type of nutrition. The human body can't actually process corn, right?
Yeah. And if you're going to have
Like,
it, like you said, it's interesting, though.
I'm going off of the Austin Powers scene with Fat Bastard, but you know.
I would
think. Go
We
ahead.
found it out by accident, though. There's so many things that people just discover by accident, and they're like, "Oh, I noticed a little trend here. Maybe it's related."
And it is so weird because, like, it's one of those things where, like, I understand, it's not true for the most part, but I understand why people look at it and say, "Oh, there's got to be aliens that came down and told us these things." There's a reason that someone like me believes there's got to be God out there for some divinity. People discovered some weird stuff randomly. Like, I have no idea how you know. Throw a pinch of acid into your corn and we'll stop dying. That's such a weird thing to come up with. You'd think eat something else would be the answer.
I don't know. I don't know if that's a symptom of not having a written history or whatever. So you just write it up to like, I don't know, God told us 200 years ago.
Well, on the subject, one of the most interesting, to me anyway, things about like food culture is actually yams. We don't eat a lot of yams here, but yams are super important in West Africa. And a lot of sub-Saharan Africans, because the environment, how wet it is, yams grow like crazy there. They're super nutritional. They're like an offshoot of potatoes. There's actually gods in West African and sub-Saharan African mythology of yams. However, yams are from the Andes. They're from South America. We know this because we have records of the Portuguese trading yams to the natives for slaves. But the yams are so ubiquitous there that to this day there are people in sub-Saharan Africa who say, no. The yams were always here. We've had them forever. Our God gave them to us. Which is just nutty. Like, we could see historically the records of the Portuguese being like, oh yes, we delivered these yams to the natives. They quite enjoyed the yams. And now we have 14 more slaves. But the natives insist, no. They were given to us by the gods.
So speaking of gods and food, another interesting thing about that is, like you said, how much like food like people have said gods gave them. Like, I know it's a myth in Greece or Rome or Italy that there was, I don't remember the name of the goddess or which goddess it was specifically, but she gave olives to the region, right?
That was it Athena?
I think it was
It
Athena.
was.
I think that's why that's the story behind how
Right, yeah,
Athens got its name.
So
Yeah.
you know how there's a city called Athens. So mythologically, I think the story behind it was a dispute between her and who's the water god that was like Percy Jackson's dad.
Poseidon.
Neptune. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it was between Athena and Poseidon. They said, we built this new city. Who are we gonna name it after? And Poseidon actually, according to Greek mythology, made horses, and then she made olives, and they were like, olives are more valuable than horses, and so they named the city after her. And I mean, anyone can fact check me if they want, but I'm pretty sure that's the myth that I heard, that I know of.
Sounds about right, and that's, I think, the same myth that Goat was talking about, which is just
That is
fascinating. Like, we have, like you said, all these different stories about these awesome foods that people give us. It's funny. Dionysus is the god of, or Dionysus, depending on how you pronounce this, the god of wine. There's a theory that the reason he's the god of wine is because he was killed in early Greek myths. And what do you do to wine? You have to kill grapes to make wine. And then he just came back one day, and that's how wine works. Because of this, I actually stole that idea, and in my setting, Masalos, the god of death, he's also the god of wine, because he was killed and then came back.
So that actually, it's interesting that you bring up the gods, because that's what I was actually getting with the whole story. in your fantasy setting, God could literally give people food. You can literally have that happen, no if, and, or buts.
God blesses us with an entire 32 pack of potions of haste, aka white monsters.
There you go. Maybe it's because of God that a certain crop grows, and if you displease him, he literally withers that particular crop because he has dominion over it.
Oh,
That'd
yeah.
be funny if a stat that was like the amount of faith in your demographic.
You could totally do it, and that'd be fun. That would be. I agree.
Very
By the way,
fun.
Jacob, Satan did give the durian fruit to humanity. That's definitely his doing.
Wow, thanks, Satan.
Jacob rules, dude. Is he in the server?
Yeah, Jacob, if you're not in our server, you need to join, my dude. You've been fantastic in chat today. I've been having a lot of fun with you. Get you on one of these calls one of these days at this rate.
I agree, Jacob. Please join the server.
While we wait to see if Jacob has joined us yet or not. Another thing that I was going to bring up that's food related is tobacco. The wacky tobacco. All the other drugs like that, cocaine and all that. They should exist in your setting too as something that medieval people totally can do. Some things like cocaine's a little bit harder, but tobacco can totally exist. In fact, people have been smoking. Jacob is already in it. Excellent. People are already, have been smoking things for a very long time. In fact, one of the coolest things about Native American mythology is how you can see that the peace pipe, they've been smoking tobacco, I think, historically longer than even the Roman Empire existed, which is really cool. And that means that you should totally have tobacco in your setting. That's cool. You don't need cigarettes. You should have cigarellos, because all a cigarello is a cigar, which a cigar is a bunch of crushed up tobacco wrapped in tobacco leaves, and a cigarello is a smaller, more tightly wrapped one. Cocaine itself is not the cocoa plant. Yes, that's what I was referring to, Jacob. The cocaine you can't do, but you can have cocoa plants and all the other fun stuff that comes from there. But yeah, add those to your setting. I think it's criminally underrated that you don't have a bunch of cool dudes walking around smoking, cigars in your setting. It's free real estate for coolness.
We all know doing drugs and smoking makes you cooler.
Yeah.
Confirmed by Kid today.
Exactly.
Cool buff.
Man, that's another thing. There's so much awesome modern stuff that I don't know why people don't have in fantasy. Cowboy hats are a great example. There's no logistical reason that you can't have cowboy hats back in the day. They just never did it because of fashion trends. So just have cowboy hats.
Well, even nowadays, the hats are entirely different, like structurally, than they would have been back in the actual Wild West days.
Yeah. So yes, this does mean in my setting, you can have a cigar and a Coca-Cola while wearing a cowboy hat. And it's still all 100% fantasy.
Absolute charisma buff.
That's what I'm saying, dude. Because you're the coolest dude. You could be playing Fallout New Vegas and still only have swords and bows. But yeah, ironically, like we've said a few times tonight, this is how you flavor your setting. Just think of cool stuff that you've never thought of or things from the modern day that you want to put in your setting and find a way to make it work. It's, to me, criminally underrated. But, another thing I've seen people do is I would suggest against giving drugs in this setting that affect players too much. Opium is a big thing. There's a lot of early editions of D&D that have rules for opium and drug usage. I know why they're there. They're there for completeness of the world. But it's one of those things where, to me, players don't ever feel the draw towards drugs unless they have benefits. So just don't give them benefits, because otherwise you're going to have this weird interplay of, I made the drugs too cool, and now I have people asking why everybody's smoking the drugs, versus drugs suck too much that the players are never going to use it. Just leave them in the suckage category. It's fine. You can allow a little bit of the American, anti-drug propaganda to win. It's okay.
You could always make it like that one barbarian class's rate of what a frenzied rage where you like get a level of exhaustion afterwards. You probably have to make it more severe, but just like uh it'll give you a big boost in the moment, but then it's gonna suck afterwards. So
Yeah. Obviously, it's
time
going
it
to be
right or don't do it at all.
temporary.
Hey, that's a great idea, Jacob. You think you have benefits. You think you healed 2d6 life, but really you're just foaming on the ground. You think you got a +5 to your will save, but really there's a demon in your butt now.
That's true. Drugs will
You
put
like
demons.
DM the one player. This is what's actually happening, but you like reverse it. You know, DMs will sometimes privately message one person, "This is what you notice," and everybody else just gets the alternate version. Just flip the script. You message to one person, make them think this is the secret, but you're telling the truth to everybody. You just trying to trick the one player.
Exactly. That would be so much fun.
And then when he asks, why is this happening? I don't understand. It's just like, yeah, the drugs wore off. I was lying to you the whole time.
Why does everything hurt? Well, I mean, you shouldn't have smoked all the meth. You ran in the room and said, Drano can't hurt me. I'm a God's special boy. And you found out you were not.
All right. Yo, back to food, dude.
I'm gonna get questions when I go downstairs.
As
Get
you
questions.
should.
You'll get thumbs ups and high fives from the whole house.
Right.
So cool.
Go ask him to the wow. Thank you, Star. All these great new cooking ideas, such as lemons and cocaine. I love it.
That's right. That's my entire diet.
Exactly.
Oh my
The
goodness.
Blood Meridian diet.
No, it's
Lemons,
not. Shut up.
cocaines, and scalp.
You scalp. Yeah. For
Nibble
currency,
on
we got.
nibble on the corners of the scalp a little bit.
Oh man.
It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. So we
Fine,
talked a
I'm
lot about
DMing you the
food.
truth, promise.
We talked a lot about food. But don't forget drinks. You can have a lot of fun with drinks. Look at all of the different wines. Humans nowadays have a lot of fun with drinks. Do you know how they invented champagne? It's because bottles kept on exploding randomly. I don't know if
Really?
anyone here knows that story. You can probably tell it better than me.
I wish I.
Basically, in the Champagne region of France,
Mhm.
bottles kept on exploding, and they thought it was cursed.
Oh, yes,
And
yes.
so
Now I remember this story.
yes, so they brought
There we
in priests to
go.
look into it, and it turned out it was just like temperature fluctuations. So they ended up getting thicker bottles. But you could totally do stuff like that. You know, you could replace potions with wine if you really wanted to, and probably have a lot of fun. Or even if you don't want it to be something that extreme, with teas, real life alchemy was basically just science without really understanding what you're doing.
Well,
Or, you know, maybe understanding what you were doing perfectly, just not understanding the whys necessarily.
That's an idea, though.
If you
I mean,
really
if you have
wanted
a certain
to.
resource
And
that,
probably
like,
have a
let's
lot
say
of
I
fun. Or
consume
it to be something
fantasy
that
champagne,
extreme.
and it gives me a buff. But let's say you have it in your stock, and then you don't drink it, and then if you wait too long, you know, the bottle pressurizes and explodes, and it ends up damaging you, and you got to keep an eye on it. That would still be interesting.
Wait, you said stock, not inventory, so clearly that's just business costs.
Oh, my bad.
Well,
Got a
that's
smart
another
boy
thing
here.
you
Kill
can
him.
do.
Oh no.
It's another thing you can
Get 'em.
always do. You could have food and drinks come in and out of availability depending on what's going on. In fact, if the players are like merchants themselves, or maybe they work for merchants from time to time, they could directly contribute to that.
I feel like, let's be honest, the adventuring is going to affect the market just by natural means.
That's true.
They're gonna do something without trying.
I guess, yeah, if they can, you know, come back to civilization with something to exchange.
hmm Adventurers tend to get pretty insanely rich with enough time. And
I picked
you
up
can
some
do a lot
biker
of
poop
funny
during my
things
last
when you're
adventure. You
rich.
guys want it?
I mean, adventures rightfully should get rich. They're psychopaths jumping into danger. Of course, they're going to make the big bucks.
Or
Yeah.
die trying.
Well, never mind.
I mean, they live the
This is
high
until
life,
they
but they
die
live
trying.
short lives.
That's the funny thing, yeah. Because I mean, if you're an adventurer and you're committed to saying, like, I'm going to go out and collect such and such resource, and you get really good at it, eventually you might actually like artificially create a shortage of said resource.
Take one day off work, the economy collapses because they don't have enough, ambergris from Wales. The
Yeah,
only guy
yeah.
who knows how to get
You
them.
were busy saving the world, but you couldn't save the local economy.
Because of the cotton gin being invented, your hometown is now destitute. Way to go, wizard.
Like,
That's fantastic. Another funny thing we don't talk about, because this is more of a modern thing, adding like sawdust and like lead into food. You could probably do some funny things with that in a fantasy setting. Maybe in your mystery meat piles, mixing in some. I'm trying to think what would be a funny like monster part. I almost want to say like black ooze, but I'm pretty sure that dissolves you.
I don't know.
I'm
It's
telling you,
almost like
troll guts is the easiest thing. Mix that in because that's totally something unscrupulous businessmen would do. It literally grows on itself. It's infinite meat.
Mhm.
Pretty
They
good.
just say, "Oh, yeah, we just need to cook it enough," and they never cook it enough.
If they didn't want to get turned into trolls, they probably should have just bought fancier meat. Really, it was their fault, not ours.
It's like you should have known better if you're buying from such and such guy. I mean,
Yeah, if you're
it's
buying
your
from
own fault.
Shady McTrollworsts, what do you expect?
You employ a wild magic sorcerer as your chef, and all of your food just starts doing wacky things to everybody.
That'd be fun.
That
Randomly,
sounds
everybody who
pretty
eats it gets purple tongues.
Yeah, no. Next thing you know, you got the corona because some guy is just like like
There's a
Anchorman 2.
surplus of unicorns in the area.
Oh yeah.
He's selling bat meat.
Oh no.
Oh no!
No,
Wild
I'm
magic
referencing
caused
Anchorman 2.
COVID.
Got some Spider-Man too. Don't worry about it. It's okay, YouTube.
No, Anchorman 2.
That too.
Eh.
It's from the tube. Don't worry, YouTube. We're good little boys here.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. We're good. We're good.
Oh, my
Ones.
Oh, I didn't. Oh, fuck.
You're fine, brother. I think
Alright,
we're allowed to
sweet.
talk about it now. I'm not sure, but we shall not mention the unknown virus of unknown origins.
It's the funniest
Yes, of
thing.
course.
If you want to,
Well, what are you guys even talking about? I don't even know where we are anymore.
Food.
Yeah, I have no idea what's going on right now.
back when the whole thing was in its heyday, people used to call it a cerveza bug to escape.
That's it. That's great.
Cervasive bug.
Now it's full circle with Cerveza Crystal. So back
Cerveza.
to Crystal. Back to food though. You should also. This is another thing I do. Steal from everybody online. Whenever you're trying to come up with food stuff for your setting, there's some awesome fantasy logos for like different beers and different food companies. I know Invicta has some really cool pins he made a long time ago. He's a like historical YouTuber who covers Rome. He's got like like Scipio Africanus' salt and stuff. Just steal those logos and throw them in your setting. It's totally fine. You're not publishing this work. Have fun with it. Now, if you are publishing it, don't steal from people. Bad person. Buy your art and pay people.
Bad, and you'll probably get sued, and there's just going to be so many issues. You don't want to deal with that.
Right.
Just hire an artist.
But if it's your home game, just it's going to be like they walk into town and there's two dueling dwarven breweries, and I just need a quick thing for them. Go steal some local brewery signs online. There's a story that that Seth Skorkowski has about the Scott Brown real estate agents. I could post it in chat if you guys want, and I'll probably link it in the description when this video gets archived. But he had his players go to a abandoned warehouse they had to clear, abandoned house they had to clear. And while there, they saw a real estate agent sign out front. He tried to just brush past it, but the players are like, "Oh no, what's the real estate agent?" And he panicked and he said, "Scott Brown, which is a local real estate company." And I'm not going to spoil the rest of the video, but I'm going to get myself one of those Scott Brown T-shirts, and when I start doing face cam stuff, I will be wearing a Scott Brown motherfucker T-shirt. It's going to be great.
Mm.
That's right.
So
I eagerly await that today.
that video is so much fun. One of these days, we'll be popular enough that he actually gets Seth on here.
It would be funny though, like if you stole some logo from like an ancient empire and like their descendants from 2,000 years like before started suing you. It's like, I'm related to Herodotus. You can't use that.
You can't use the word history. That's our word.
Oh, no.
Speaking of that, street food and street vendors. That's something that I see a lot of people think is a modern invention. That's actually super old. We have, like, in Pompeii, which was completely perfectly preserved, vats of food that they were eating at the time. They basically had these huge countertops with these big rings on them, and those rings that they had a bunch of stew or different like easy to grab dishes like what would be pasta these days, and they'd give you a scoop of that, and you'd pay for it there. So they had ready to eat fast food there already back in the day. So totally have that in your setting too. Not every time the players go out to eat.
I think.
Say again?
I think the Byzantines also had that. Like they had food stalls everywhere.
Oh yeah. And it's awesome that they have this back then, and totally steal from it and use it. Like, it's super cool. Have all these strange carts with these exotic foods. And the cool thing is, if there's a weirdo selling food and the players think, "Oh, that's weird and gross, you never want to see that again," well, guess what? That was just that one guy who was selling rat kebabs. That doesn't have to be a setting-specific thing. It was just one weirdo. And you never have to worry about being embarrassed again. I actually have a story about that. In my home game, the players were in a North Nordic region. What's up? What'd you say, Star?
Well, I said unless it's fun, then you can embarrass them.
Of course.
As long as it's fun for everybody.
So, I was going to say, in my home game, I actually had a fun little story about that. My players were in my Nordic setting. The part of there was like the far north. There's Viking type things, all that happiness. While they were there, they met a guy who was from what would be the fantasy setting that has Mexico, and he was selling churros because I thought that'd be kind of cute and fun. And churros could totally exist in the far north. The players fell in love with it, and one player took all the money he got from all of his adventuring, and before the campaign ended, he sold a bunch of his magic items to not only buy the churro business, but to set up multiple churro businesses across the world. That was the entire thing he wanted to do. And now there are churros in all the other cities across the north and across different parts of the world that have this player's, character thing. And it's just hysterical that there's now a churro empire because one of the players decided to set it up.
He converted it into a franchise.
He really did. He's like what's the guy who went with the McDonald's brothers? Roy Kroc, right?
Yes.
I don't know. Let's assume that's it.
Yeah. He took McDonald's from a small place to international, baby.
So funny though that a food can become so ubiquitous. I hope I'm using the right word, ubiquitous, with a certain to like the point where it's obviously an example of political extremism. But the Serbian guy that goes remove kebab.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, like you say kebab and everybody knows who you're talking about.
Serbians are fun people. Well, one day I'll tell the story of how genocide started because of a bottle, but that's a story when I want to get demonetized.
That's a story for another day.
Exactly.
Yeah, join kids' Discord server so you can hear all about it.
Oh, yes.
That's right.
Well, I think that this is a good spot to wrap it up. I think we fully touched on all the different topics related to foods. We don't have to go for the full 2 hours.
I agree.
And with that, I would like to thank everybody for being on here tonight with me. And for the rest of you, thank you all, lords and ladies, for joining us tonight. I hope you all have an excellent
It was
day,
a
and I will
pleasure.